Right. Okay. So if I click, oh, again, you
Got it.
clicked and it worked. So
Yes, that one did.
Yeah.
You'll need to check where you're recording to. You might be recording to your local PC. You might be recording to the cloud. And I just did one yesterday where the guy was convinced he was recording to the cloud and he thought he'd lost everything. And in fact, no, it was on the PC.
Right. Okay. Cool. So I'm genuinely, like, hand on heart, genuinely surprised that you said yes. I don't know why you have, to be fair.
Clearly, I've got too much time on my hands.
I guess so. Yeah.
No, it's just the fact that you basically said, I know this is a long shot, and you'll probably say no, but how about it? And it's like, well, okay then, why not?
Fair enough. Well, so let me.
I like long shots. I'm an Everton fan.
Fair one. Yeah, that's a very fair, thing to say. So I guess I'll introduce you. So you're the William R. Rhodes Professor of International Economics and Professor of International and Public Affairs at Brown University. That's probably one of the longest titles.
It's quite a mouthful, isn't it?
For a Professor of Economics, well, international policy and economics, etc. But you also direct the William Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance at the Waddesdon Institute of Public.
Keep going.
Is it Public Affairs?
International and Public Affairs. That's exactly right. Yes.
So basically, your interest is economics and
this is Lucy.
That's Lucy.
For everyone who's watching. This is Lucy.
Oh, she's lovely.
She's scratching herself. So anyway, yes, no. So basically, I'm a political economist. What does that mean? It means that there's two ways of looking at economics. One is it's kind of a theory of how the world works, and in that regard, it's quite good sometimes and quite not so good other times. I also study it as a thing in the world, and here's what I mean by this. Imagine that somebody said to you, you're in a debate with someone, you're a politician, and somebody says to you, well, I'm sorry, but that point is anthropologically illiterate. No one would give a shit, right? But if you turn around to someone and say, that's economically illiterate, you've got a very, very powerful rhetorical device, because clearly it means you're an idiot because you don't understand economics. And there's something uniquely powerful about economics as a social science, and that it gets to define for everybody else what the word value means, what the word efficiency means, right? What, how the world really works in a fundamental way. If somebody said, that's sociologically illiterate, again, nobody would actually care. But because if you say economically illiterate, very different story. So yeah, I'm interested in it as a thing in the world.
So I guess the first thing is that often when, for example, when people are talking on the BBC or whether it's Sky News, and we kind of hear from the kind of the great and the good, the talking heads about economics, etc., it all seems very, very abstract. And I guess I don't know if it's done intentionally, in order to kind of make people go, I'm not going to bother listen to this. This sounds like bollocks. So I'm just going to tune out. And it doesn't affect me, but actually it does affect you. And I suspect that sometimes they make it seem kind of dry and a bit ethereal because they don't want people knowing, because they try and kind of make things seem more complex. And I know there are complex things within economics, but they always seem to make it sound more complex than it needs to be. Why is that?
Well, I'll give you an analog, right? Why is Bitcoin so complex? Right, what you got to understand: blockchains, distributed ledgers, Hitoshi, scratch systems, whatever, blah blah blah, all the software coding language, right? Why? Because at the end of the day, there's probably nothing there. Yeah. Right, it's people hawking bullshit. So when it's insanely complex for no apparent reason, it's usually a good sign. I'll give you another example back from the financial crisis a decade or more ago now, when we were all taught that it was basically labor was overspending. And that's why we all need to tighten our belts and have this big dose of austerity, which basically destroyed the north of England, because there was none in London. And what that actually was the government was using its powers and the balance sheet of the state to basically bail out these banks. Now, they told us they were too big to fail, so they had to do it. But what that meant was essentially that the taxpayer was being used to bail out the assets and incomes of the top 20% of the population. So the bottom 80 were basically, bailing out the top 20%. The poor were literally bailing out the rich. And then to compound it, to make that, then the poor had to do with less going forward. Now, if they had actually told the truth and said that's what's going on, they would never have gotten away with it, right? So you have to then talk about, well, it's systemic risk and look over there because it's really Labour spending too much. And if Labour spending too much did this, you have to ask why it's got anything to do with American mortgages and why it's a global financial crisis, right? But nonetheless, that's it. It's the bait and switch. It's the look over there. Things are super complex. Trust me, we are the experts. And then, people begin to see through this because they live through that. And they begin to sniff out the bullshit and recognize it for what it is. And at that point, that's when people start to lose faith. That's when they start to lose trust. That's when they start to listen to Farage. That's when Brexit becomes a thing, which is just another look over here because basically we're really doing stuff over here. But, that's what happens when you begin to lose trust in the system because they make it opaque and they make it kind of difficult to understand. Sometimes because it is difficult to understand, but a lot of the time because they're just disguising what they're doing, because if they were really honest about it, they'd never get away with it.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned Brexit there, because when Brexit happened, there was I'm sure you've heard of the Green Party in the UK. I know obviously you live in the States, but the Green Party, Caroline Lucas, and there was a Facebook advert that got put out basically saying that Caroline Lucas wanted to interview or talk to people that were kind of in my so the area that I'm from was one of the highest Brexit highest Brexit voting areas in the country. I wanted to kind of understand why, and I just happened to just make a comment on this Facebook post, sort of sponsored advert, what it was, just kind of offhand saying, well, I could tell you, it's taken me about 5 minutes. And her researcher got in touch and said, so why is it? And I said, well, and I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm just a mortgage broker. But I said, for me, it was a case of, if you've consistently shafted over a number of generations, this area in particular, which is kind of the Midlands and the North, where it was mining area, then it got, the industrial kind of
deindustrialization, the whole lot, absolutely.
And I said, you've basically ruined not only kind of that generation, then their children's generation. They've got worse schooling, worse education, worse healthcare, and they've got more insecure jobs, all that kind of stuff. I said, and then you give them the chance to kind of make a change, and even though that might be an incredibly terrifying change, if you give someone the chance to give David Cameron a bloody nose, even then they're going to take it. And I said, well, it's very simple. It's kind of all these kind of talking heads going, it's going to get really bad, it's going to be terrible. They're thinking, well, how much worse can this get?
Right, exactly. And how come it's never bad for you, Mr. Talking Head, right? How come it's never bad for you, right? London always seems to do fine. No, that's exactly right. It's exactly what happened. Tell you a great book to read for that. I did a podcast with her recently. You can find it on the Road Center podcast. But you should read her book. She was one of Trump's national security teams, called Fiona Hill. She's the one who went to Congress and testified all the stuff about Ukraine a couple of years back. She's from Bishop's Auckland.
Right. Okay.
Right. So she has this brilliant book called There's Nothing for You Here, which is actually, it's what her dad said. It says, there's nothing for you here, pet. Yeah. And it's about basically, how she got out, went to university, ended up in America. Story very similar to my own. And it's exactly what she said. She's like, you had these, very tight-knit working class communities that finally saw a bit of prosperity in the 50s and 60s, start to come apart in the 70s, completely destroyed in the 80s. Everybody who was, supporting a house and a family and all that sort of stuff ends up working as a hospital porter, or if they're lucky, this kind of stuff. And there's just a complete lack of faith in governing institutions and governing elites. It's like it's waiting for populists to pick it up. Absolutely. Yeah. I got to let the dog out. She's whining to get out now.
Oh, so I know it's yeah. You go and sort out Lucy. She looks like a magnificent beast. Bless her.
She is indeed. She's an 85-pound golden retriever and very lovely.
So
anyway, Scottish dog, actually. I don't know if people know this. Golden retrievers are Scottish dogs, and they actually have webbed feet for swimming. Yeah, they've got little webs between their paws.
I didn't know that.
I know, they're not mental.
That is mental, actually. Yeah, but why do they have so much hair then? Because if they're good for swimming, doesn't that act as a drag?
It probably does, but it also acts as a blanket so they can swim in the water.
Yeah.
It's very oily. It keeps them warm when it's wet.
Yeah, the old lanolin.
Exactly.
So
anyway, where were we? We were back on populism in the north.
I'm just noticing your guitars. So and obviously you do play. I'm guessing a bit.
Yes. Also, look, there's a ta-da.
Ah, okay.
Show and tell.
So is this your recording studio?
Yes.
Ah, right. Okay. So, so I mean, you're in Rhode Island.
Yes, the
Okay.
smallest state, wedged between Massachusetts and Connecticut.
Right. Okay. Cool. So a lot of people won't know this, but in terms of I've read about your kind of upbringing, and you basically were brought up on the welfare state in Scotland. But
Correct.
you did so you kind of whether it's rags to riches, I don't know, but it kind of a good
Well,
guy
certainly
done well.
rags to better than rags. I wouldn't quite say riches, but
Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean it's the story that I have with this that I will tell to my dying day, and I feel so sorry for the generations that came after me, is if you want a great example of a bait and switch, think about what happened with student loans. So back in the day in the 1980s, and me and Fiona Hill, who I mentioned earlier, right? Not only was going to university free, you didn't have to pay any fees, right?
Yeah.
They gave you a bursary, they gave you a grant if you were poor to actually
Mm.
go. Did it cover everything? No, you had to work, you had to do stuff, all the rest of it, but it made it possible, right? Then they bring in this whole big expansion of higher education under New Labour, and then they basically say, okay, well, now we're going to start charging fees for it. Coming from my background, if you had said to me you need to have the ability to tap 40,000 quid in debt to go to university, my family didn't even have a bank account.
Mm.
Right, we're part of the so-called like the idea of that would be ridiculous, right? Now, back in the day when I did it, the argument for making it free was that you had about 6 to 10% of people in higher education, and they all went into jobs that put them in a much higher tax bracket. So over their lifetime, they would pay back whatever you would have charged them in fees,
Yeah.
and then some more. So what do? We then lower the tax brackets, right? Chuck many, many more people in higher education so that the returns to a degree collapse. And then you put tons of debt on them to the point that 20% of the student loan book is now insolvent and another 20% on its way. And a whole generation of people will literally never pay this debt back because wages have collapsed.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just like, what was that for? Why did you do that? You had something that totally worked and you turned it in for something that was much, much worse. Yeah, and that seems to be a lot of what's happened. Not yet more stuff that's pissed people off over the past 20 years.
And it is difficult. I mean, so in terms of questions, I kind of put it out because, of course, I was, as I say, I'm shocked that we're doing this. So I asked kind of people, if you've got any questions, then hit me up. And you're talking about kind of what happened in the past. And one of the questions was from a guy called Martin, who's a mortgage broker. He runs a company called The Money Group. And he asked if you had a time machine, what should we have done differently back in 2008 that we didn't?
Oh, back in 2008. You could go even further back. What should we have done in 1979? But let's start in 2008. I would have ring fenced, as they put it in that language, protected all of the individual depositors. I would have given a straightforward credit guarantee to all the depositors, which we kind of did once Northern Lock went down. Hang on, the dog's back.
No worries.
You sit in. But made it clear, right? Sort of ex ante that deposit insurance is there. So you don't get a bank run, and then you basically allow the banks themselves to fail, right? Then if you have too big to fail, you basically have an extortion, because I'm a permanent risk, and therefore I can do whatever I want. I can behave badly. I can do all this sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, you will just have to put up with my bad behavior because I'm too big a risk. You can't let me fail. You have to end that, right? So that would have been it. Basically, ring fence everything up front, give the credit guarantees to the depositor so you don't have to worry about bank run, and then basically just let them fail. They had plenty of good assets. They were over levered with some bad assets. You could have split them off into two. You could have put all the bad assets into one state-run bank and run it down, kind of like the Federal Reserve did eventually with all the bad assets on their book. And then you could have actually broken up those banks and got them to a much smaller footprint so that they're individually small enough to fail, and therefore, when they do go down, they don't take the system with them. And there was the Vickers report in Britain in around 2012-13 was a good step in that direction, but it was never really fully implemented. And what you've got now is a banking system that's even more consolidated than what you had in 2008. So it was a bit of a missed opportunity. The other thing is, the whole austerity thing, I mean, I wrote a whole book about it, was just dreadful. I mean, Preston lost 1/3 of its budget. I mean, it tells you about the mental disconnect between the people in London and the people in the rest of the country. When you look at a place like Preston, if you look at a place like Dundee, where I'm from, if you look at Belfast, there's a great example. Pretty much half of all consumption comes from government transfers. right? These places are just hollowed out after they deindustrialized, and they live off of state transfers. If you then say we're all tightening our belt, the asymmetry of the hit on those communities is just astonishing, right? It's like you take a pencil cut, they get stabbed in the neck with a samurai sword, right? Oh, we're both taking cuts, right? It's like, no, totally different. And, that's also something that we shouldn't have done. But if you remember back in the time, I mean, Cameron and Osborne were so duplicitous on this. Cameron came into power with this whole thing about accepting the kind of new public settlement of new labour and expanded social services and compassionate conservatism in the big society and all that. And the minute they had the opportunity, it was like, let's destroy what
Let's
little
just
was
shaft
left
everyone.
of the welfare state. Absolutely, let's destroy what is left of the welfare state, and that became the mission. So people vote for. There was a big crisis, and every government that was in power got voted out. The normal opposition came in. They eventually get voted out. Then you start to get the populist opposition coming in a lots of places, France, Italy, etc. Britain with Brexit, if you want to put it that way. You think of the SNP in a way as the vanguard party of this in the UK. And it all sort of, goes along with this kind of collapse in faith in institutions that we have now and that we're dealing with. So, yeah, there's a couple of things. Don't bail the buggers out and don't make the poor pay. Would have been pretty simple.
And you see, but again, if you say that too, so there's a lot of people that in my industry, I don't like calling it an industry because I don't actually produce anything. It's not a productive capacity. But in my industry, there's a lot of people that profess to be experts and kind of talking heads, and they've got all the knowledge. And actually, just there, right, say, don't let the banks fail. Don't bail them out and don't shaft poor people. You see, that's very, very simple, isn't it?
It's pretty simple, isn't it?
I guess, but
I mean, here's one, right? If you want to run capitalism, there has to be risk as well as reward. If you're in the position whereby somebody else is absorbing the risk and somebody else is taking the reward, it's called an extortion racket. It's not called capitalism, right? You're meant to get the rewards because you take the risks. You're not meant to get outsized rewards because you're pushing the risk onto somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's what we were doing.
Yeah. And so following on from that, I mean,
who's your next question? Who's your next question?
But following on from that, is there a way of fixing it? And why do people consistently vote against their own interests? I mean, that's the whole thing, it's the whole, the axe, the axe convinced the trees to vote for it because it was made of the same stuff. It's
right. I to be honest, I always resist that one. I don't think people. I think a better way of thinking about it is this way: why do people define their interests in ways that are hard to understand from a kind of materialist point of view? And it could be simply because people. I come from a long line of working class conservatives. Like I'm literally the only lefty in the whole family. I'm pretty sure that, like deep down inside in the 1930s, my grandmother and grandfather were Catholic brown shirts. So now that to me is totally antithetical. But what is it that they cared about? Well, Franco summed it up well: faith, family, God, right? This is what they cared about. Why is it that people in America go mental over abortion rights? Because that's what they care about. I think we need to be kind of like more agnostic or at least tolerant of what people value, right? If some people really value independence from the EU, you might think that's totally wrong-headed. But to me, it's more interesting to think about, well, why do they think that that's the issue? And then when you start following those stories around, that's when you find out that there's, oh, look, there happen to be a whole bunch of British billionaires who are bankrolling all this bullshit. I wonder why they're doing that, right? And that's the way that I think is, more productive. Because otherwise you get into this ridiculous position, which you see in the United States all the time with the Democrats, where it's like, we're all cool people who went to Harvard. We understand how the world works. Now you just need to think the way we do, which is just guaranteed to fail because it's patronizing bullshit, right? So, yeah, I tend to think about it that way. I don't know if that helps.
I mean, do you think that our voting system in the UK causes a lot of that? Because I mean, to be fair, I have always thought, so there's a lot of people. So I'd be classed as a lefty, whether I'm loony or not is another matter. But whilst there's a lot of people that I disagree with politically and economically about various kind of things, I do think they should have a voice. And in so many elections where vast swathes of the people voted for what was UKIP before it went a little bit crazy, but kind of there's lots of people that vote for Green parties. There's lots of people that vote for kind of anti-establishment parties, but they don't get a voice, and therefore you push it underground. And when you kind of do that, this that kind of pus builds up, and it's got to find an expression somewhere.
I
and
have,
then
right,
that
absolutely. So
and
yeah,
so
I'll give you an example of this. I'm only wearing a Scotland top because I'm going to the gym after this, and this is the first thing I grabbed. It's not a political statement, right?
right.
But for a long time, I was very skeptical of the whole notion of Scottish independence, and I've become much more sympathetic over time. And I'll just give you two main reasons why. The first one is exactly what you just said. Nobody in Scotland, well, one third of Scotland votes for the Tories.
Yeah,
Never enough for them to have a majority. They always end up with a Tory government, right? You just can only do this for so long before you have to say enough, because that is
yeah,
basically completely anti-democratic. And the second one is, if you think about the way that Britain's structured and how Britain grows, 22% of GDP, so almost a quarter of the economy. And if you actually do it as the broader London area, it's 34% of the economy. Comes out of Greater London, right? It's insane. So yes, there's what economists call value added occurring in the other parts of the country, but know that much. And a huge part of the world, as we mentioned earlier, places like Preston, Belfast, live off of transfers from the government. Now, if you think about, Scotland is essentially two cities that are reasonably close together that are quite well networked, where 80% of the people live.
yeah.
And we know that most growth happens in cities. An alternative way of thinking about the UK is basically, could you imagine a proper regionalised UK where instead of spending money on high speed 2, because let's face it, nobody actually wants to go to Birmingham.
Yeah.
Sorry, Birmingham, right?
No, it's true. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but instead of that, you actually properly network Sheffield and Liverpool and Manchester, right, and Sunderland
Mhm.
and Newcastle, right, and you basically make it possible for that to become kind of a growth area in itself.
Yeah,
And then you do the same thing with Scotland, with Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee, Aberdeen, right? You could have a much more balanced economy across the whole of the UK. And you say that to people and they go, "Oh, that totally makes sense." And it's like, okay, well, why don't we do it? Why
so
why are we still why are we still caring about people like Boris living in from Hampstead and all this bullshit?
but presumably it's because it kind of, there's so many, well, there's, I don't know if this is perhaps me just being cynical, but there's too much power in too few hands that have got their own interests that have been entrenched for generations, that they don't, it's not that they wouldn't change per se, it's that they don't think they have to because they've never seen anything different.
No, there's that, right? But you can keep this thing going, which is this, if you will, kind of somewhat finance debt and consumption dependent model in London that makes super profits and then chucks them out to the rest of the country, which is not exactly a sustainable thing, particularly now things like Russian oligarch money and all that is on the
Yeah,
way out, right?
yeah,
London grad no more. So if the shine goes off of that, you're going to have something else to do. And the thing is, I mean, if I'm up north where you lot live, I mean, I look around. I mean, I'm looking at sort of, great universities. I'm looking at, a skilled population. I'm looking at a whole host of cities that just basically need infrastructural investment that hasn't happened for 40 years.
yeah,
Right? I mean, if you think about leveling up, right? Leveling up is basically the Tory party saying, oh, yeah, all that shit we didn't do for 40 years, we probably should make a start now. That's
yeah,
literally what leveling up is.
yeah.
So, rather than leveling up, why not break up? Why not basically just, go for complete autonomy for these regions and then really, really build up that infrastructure and try and just get a much more balanced UK as a kind of 20 to 25-year project? I think
Why,
that's really the
why,
only way to do it.
why is it though? Because of course, I mean, I think that's a great idea, and it'd be lovely to get kind of proper transport systems in this area and further north.
I
But
mean,
of
just
course,
getting to Sheffield, it's just like I
I
can
know,
honestly fly
yeah,
to Cuba easier than I can get to Sheffield. I mean, it's ridiculous.
yeah. But of course, then people start bleating on about, oh, we've got all this public debt. We've borrowed, and borrowed, and that's because they kind of misunderstand the difference between
Yeah,
a
you want me to
nation
do the
budget
debt stuff? Yeah.
and a household
Right,
budget.
okay.
So could we
This is the
could you
greatest,
just kind of
yeah.
spell that out for people?
All right. So this view is increasingly associated with a view called MMT. I'm not an MMTer. I'm MMT adjacent. We can talk about that if you want. But nonetheless, the basic story is very straightforward, right? Here's the thing. It's absolutely true that Mark Blyth, if he spends too much, will get into trouble. Mark Blyth is not a state. Why is that different? Because states have these things called bonds. Now, if I issued Mark Blyth a 30-year bond, you'd never buy it because I'll probably be dead in 30 years. States don't die because they have taxpayers that have other kids. So you can issue intergenerational debt. If the economy grows at any rate close to or better, faster than the rate of interest on the debt, basically, the debt shrinks over time as the economy grows.
Yeah.
Right? I can't play that trick. No household can play that trick. States do. Second thing is, if you could hold Mark Blyth pounds, but you'd be an idiot, right? But you're willing to hold British pounds. Why? Because of that, basically, that capacity of the state to issue intergenerational debt and to raise taxes and all that sort of stuff. And finally, if you really want to push it into the sort of the MMT, modern monetary theory way of thinking about it, it's not even that. It's at the end of the day, states are the people that produce the money that we all need. And a very simple way to think about this is, why is it that you pay your taxes in April, right? Is it the same as the US? Right.
Yeah.
So why is it we spend 4 months or 5 months of the year running around like idiots trying to get together these bits of paper or the electronic equivalent that basically we hand back to the people who made the bits of paper?
Yeah.
When you think about it that way, it's
crazy,
a bit mad when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
And but the serious point on this is essentially that states basically provide the means of payment, etc., and we're the people who use that stuff. Now, when you're a currency user, you can go bankrupt. I don't have a printing press, but as we've shown with COVID, as we've shown with the financial crisis, when you do have a printing press, it solves a lot of problems. Now, you accumulate a lot of debt, and at some point somebody says, well, what about the debt? Do we have too much debt? Well, I've spent my whole life listening to this, right? Is 60% too much? Is 100% too much? Is 120% too much? Italy was meant to go bankrupt at 110, sailing past 150. Now, is it great that you have all this debt, particularly if interest rates go up and then you have to devote more of your budget to paying back the interest payments? No, but by the same token, if you have inflation, what happens is it eats away the real value of the debt.
Yeah.
Right. So right now, here's a good example for people, right? And for you guys in particular, right? I just remortgaged this house and remortgage in another place I have in Boston. Now, why am I doing this? Because I know rates will rise, but I know rates will not rise relative to the rate of inflation.
Yeah.
Right. Because it would crush the economy too much. So rates are probably going to go up to about 3-4% maximum, right? And if you've got 7% inflation, that's still a negative real rate.
Yeah.
And I've locked it in at 2.75. Run this out over 15 years, half the mortgage is going to be eaten away by the inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the whole thing about debt is both more complex, but also much more simple. States are not households. States with printing presses, it's not a magic money tree. It's not. There are limits, right? I'm happy to talk about that. But you know what? It's a nice trick if you can play it.
So because of that, I mean, of course, people kind of argue about the benefits and the whys and wherefores of quantitative easing and what kind of the benefit or the disbenefit that can have, and how much you should do and how much you shouldn't do, and what people, what kind of assets that they should buy, or should it actually just be distributed to people. But then there's just the whole thing of, oh, well, we're going to kick in with hyperinflation, which I think is broadly speaking bollocks, given that we've printed I don't know how many trillions and we've been unable to generate an inflation, and yet now we've had
very simple point on that one, right? The sort of the mechanism on that hyperinflation story is the government's printing all this money. There's more money than stuff, therefore the relative prices shift, and that's why they go through the roof, right?
Yeah.
It's a simple volume effect, right? That's actually not how it works. And if people are interested in this, I dare you to do the following. Go to the Bank of England website or just Google the following: Bank of England Quarterly Report 2014 Q1. Download it. First 15 pages is basically how money works in the modern economy, according to Bank of England. 97% of the money we spend is bank credit. Mm-hmm. It's nothing to do with central bank printing money and central bank reserves or any of that sort of stuff. And banks lend on the expectation of profitability. If banks don't think that they're going to make profits, they don't lend. If they're not flooding us with cash, you can't have the hyperinflation effect. What happens in hyperinflations in Zimbabwe, everybody's favorite example, or Weimar Germany, is like the state collapses and no one has any faith in their money anymore and they want to substitute. We're miles away from that one, unless you're a mental Bitcoiner, but that's an entirely different story. I'll try and let the dog out again. Hold on.
Yeah, no worries, yeah, sure.
Do you want it again? Go on, get it, stay it. Daft thing. Anyway, where were we?
So on that basis, kind of, because of course inflation is taking hold and all that kind of stuff, and the government clearly, with the spring statement that happened the other day, it was kind of I don't know if you saw that, but I thought it was a bit of a damp squib in terms of we're going to knock 5 pence a litre off in fuel duty, taking, rolling back prices to where they were last Saturday. Do you know what I mean? It's
Exactly,
mental.
right. Yeah.
And kind of, we're going to give you a penny off income tax, which he might not even be chancellor. And also that whole thing, we're going to, well, if I've got something in one hand and a promise in the other, what have I got? And not to mention the fact that, of course, we're going to be wealthier down the line. That's great if you're getting all your income off kind of passive streams like investments, dividends, all that.
Yeah,
kind of
if
stuff.
you're
But if you've got to work,
absolutely.
If you've got to work,
yeah,
it makes
bollocks.
no difference whatsoever. How well, two questions, I guess. How bad is the cost of living crisis in the UK going to get? Because I suspect, back in November, I saw the price of ammonium nitrate shoot up. And that's the only thing that I really look at, because I'm not an economist and I don't have the time to do all that. But the reason I look at ammonium nitrate is that it's one of the precursors to nitrogen, and nitrogen fertilizer. And obviously, if we didn't have nitrogen fertilizer, about half the world's population would be able to eat. And therefore, if we've got inflation in ammonia and in gas, that leads into fuel and then to food, and therefore that can have a big impact on a lot of people.
Yes.
Now, so how bad is it going to get, and how much have we actually seen of it yet?
So you're right to look at that, and it's a great indicator. And where it's really going to get bad isn't in Britain. I mean, Britain's going to be bad, but bad is always relative, right? You want to talk about Egypt. You want to talk about places where you've got young populations, agriculture is dependent upon imports, and they're going to be absolutely walloped with poor countries, heavily indebted countries. That's where you're really going to see problems. The whole of the Middle East is at risk in this regard, except the oil exporters who are making money hand over fist.
Yeah.
So that's one. But going back to Britain, I mean, let's have a little degree of sympathy for Rishi Sunak, who, to me, by the way, has the best Star Trek Vulcan name of all time, as far as I can figure out. I mean, like, you can't really be a real person called Rishi Sunak, because that is a Star Trek character, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, the point is a little bit of sympathy for him in this one. I mean, he's been hit by sort of global forces. You have this pandemic lockdown, you have worsening geopolitical tensions, now you have an embargo against Russia. It's just a nightmare. All of these things are supply side things. And then you get to the sort of, I posted this on Twitter the other day, so things are getting more expensive, right, mummy? Yes, they are. Why is that? Well, because we had this idiot idea of building everything the other side of the world and shipping it home, and it turns out that plus the war plus COVID all broke down. Okay, so why does the Bank of England then want to make money more expensive? Won't that make things worse? Yes, but only for people who are in debt. For everyone who has assets, it's like getting free money in your bank account. But mummy, isn't that unfair? Shut up, sweetie. Don't be a communist, right? So that's it in a nutshell, right?
Yeah.
Now, given this, they've got one tool they've been using vociferously for the past 20 years, which is raising lower interest rates and lower and lower and lower. Now they're going to put them up a little bit. How is an interest rate rise going to deal with basically a supply shock in wheat?
Well, it won't.
It's got nothing to do with it, right? So, they're performing, but the levers that they're used to pulling just aren't working because these are global forces. Now, what does it mean? Britain imports at least, I think, is it a third or 2/3 of its food, right? So that's getting more expensive. Your productivity growth since 2008 has basically been flatlined, if not negative. And essentially, you're a highly unequal society. So what that means is that it's going to get really, really tough for food and fuel for basically the bottom 40% of income earners in Britain in a way that it hasn't done in at least a generation. And how long will this last? It depends how long the war in Ukraine lasts. If that one lasts much longer than people think, which I think it will, then, these effects could be generational in the sense that, they'll level out after about 5 years when you get used to it. But what it's going to do is it's going to make highly unequal and highly indebted societies much more fragile than they already are. And it's not the public debt I worry about, it's the private debt.
Yeah.
Right. Britain lives off of credit, particularly at the bottom end of the scale, and it's expensive credit. And if you basically have, you're taking your income to just basically keep the credit flows going, and suddenly you're hit with a shock where your electricity bill doubles and your food bill doubles, how do you maintain those credit flows? And if you don't do that, then you're well on your way to causing a financial crisis in the private credit markets, not the public credit markets.
Yeah.
And then the state has to step in again, and then they fix that one, and that leads to more public debt. And then people turn around and go, look at all that debt. We've been spending like sailors. And you go, oh, Jesus, not again. So, yes, that's sort of unfortunately how it's going to play out.
So what does it mean? So, I mean, for people, of course, that might be listening to this, there'll be a few people that haven't watched this, but they'll be probably my mates. But what does it mean for house prices? Because, of course, I did think, to be fair, when the Bank of England raised the base rate, I was kind of sat there thinking that doesn't. So, for people that are watching this, the reason that banks increasing interest rates is to make things more expensive. The theory goes that then, if things are more expensive, people won't buy as much of them. Consumption drops, therefore demand drops, and therefore prices level out. That's the theory, broadly
Correct.
speaking. But of course, that only works if the things that are going up in price you can have less of, but you can't live in a different place.
With less
you
food.
can't eat less, and you can't consume less. If you need to be warm, you need to wash yourself with warm water. That so it's not going to reduce consumption. Therefore, it just makes a bad situation worse.
Exactly.
As a consequence, people have kind of over leveraged themselves, I think, particularly in London, with regards to mortgages and house prices and that kind of stuff.
Oh, have a look at the chart that I posted on Twitter a couple of days ago of basically price to income ratios from the 80s and now. Oh my God, it's mind blowing. I think I called it something like, if a picture paints 1,000 screams in 2 pictures or something like this, why you'll never have a house. Yes.
So how does this play out? Because of course, people have over leveraged, people have been addicted, and it's been a worry for me as a mortgage broker in the sense that people have been so fixated on these incredibly low interest rates and scrambling over themselves to get them and borrow as much as they can. And of course, if I turn around and say, so it's like the tragedy of the commons. If I turn around and say that's a bad idea, don't borrow that much, they go to the broker down the road and he does it.
Yeah.
But then I've got to do it, even though I know that
totally.
This is a bad
Welcome
idea.
to the party. You got it. What's the old line? You got to keep dancing till the music stops. I mean, that's exactly it.
So
yeah,
where does this,
the thing about it this way, most wealth accumulation for people in the UK has, for the whole 2 generations now, come from the price of housing.
Yeah,
right? That's your return. That's the nest egg, right? That's the ATM if you play it right and you flip from property to property. And the thing that's always puzzled me about the UK is you're doing this with adjustable rate mortgages. So, those adjustments can get pretty harsh. So the real thing for me is, what's the sensitivity to the interest rate change? I mean, you could be heavily levered at 2% and make it work. If it goes to 5, is it even possible for you to do it? Plus, at the same time that your food bill's going up, your transport bill's going up, your heating bill's going up, right? So it's the combination of those factors. Now, does this mean there's going to be a big housing crash, and all that sort of stuff? As Yoda would say, hard to see the future is. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was an adjustment in this one. But at the same time, here's another reason why not. What else is there to put your money into?
Well, very little, and also there's not enough houses being built. We've got a structural issue with not building enough homes.
Oh God, yeah.
We've got a growing and an aging population, and so this is one of the things where, and this is one of the reasons why it's always trying to explain to people. Yes, house prices will keep rising, but that doesn't mean you should spend over the odds, because it's not because we've got a growing economy. It's because we've got a shrinking supply.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it will end at some point, and then when it does, we've got to look into the box and see if it was true or not.
Right.
And we might not want to look in the box.
Yeah. I mean, this all goes back to, in a sense, what economists call growth models, right? What is basically the business model by which Britain makes its way in the world? And for a long time, it has basically been a sort of highly financialized, debt-driven consumption model, which, so long as somebody else is basically giving you their money to basically invest and play with, and then, you're able to, lever up on the basis of that into houses and into equities and other such things, then yeah, this is sustainable. But and behind it all has been a historic drop in interest rates that began in the 90s and, has continued to the present and is now basically zero. If we're coming off of this, particularly into a period of sustained inflation, it's not clear to me that business model has a real future. Now, does that mean that the rest of the UK is bankrupt in that sense? I mean, and this is my sort of Brexit line. It's like, the idea that, the UK economy is entirely composed of people swapping houses is somewhat fallacious. There's, companies, there's, design, there's tech, there's biotech, there's meds, there's a bunch of stuff that Britain does that still has value. But, at the end of the day, it has been living long and large on private sector generated credit for a long time, and that may have to stop. But to do that, to make people, if people are going to have the consumption patterns that they have without becoming even poorer in a highly unequal society, you have to increase productivity. And that's really hard to do in an economy that's so heavily service sector.
Yeah.
Right. If I can't automate more. Well, we can automate mortgage processing. It's called robo signing, and it's a bad idea, right? So
Yeah.
there's a limit to what you can do to add capital to get to get output up, and at the same time, do we need more mortgages? Is that the
No.
answer, right? So it's not clear when you've got an aging population, pretty stagnant productivity. If you wean yourself off credit, how do you do that without basically taking a kind of step down in consumption? It's not going to, whoever is running the British economy for the next 3 or 4 cycles, it's not going to be easy.
So on the basis of that, because it is going to get a bit tricky, at what point, because we've already had, is it 3 months of negative growth? I love that term, negative growth. So 2 quarters of that is a technical recession.
Yeah.
Are we headed into a recession? And if so, is it going to be anywhere close to 2008?
So it's very contrary signals, and this is why a lot of people are looking at the 70s as an analog, and other people are looking at the 40s as an analog, right? So, for example, US unemployment just fell to 3.8%. Right, quarter on quarter growth for the last 4 months in the US was 5.6%. That shit hasn't happened since like the 60s, right? I think there's a piece on the BBC about that today that goes through it, right? So on the one hand, it's tearing up, right? On the other hand, you have all these forces coming down, which are basically going to slow you down, which is fuel prices, energy prices, geopolitical dislocation, the fact that you can't get any of the chips you want for any of the stuff you want to make for 2 years. So all this stuff is like slowing down. So there's these very contradictory forces hitting at once. So a lot of people look to the 70s, this period of so-called stagflation, where you have economic stagnation and inflation and unemployment rising at the same time. And I think in different places it's going to work out different ways. Britain may be more stagflationary than the US is, in the sense that US is such a big economy that it can generate enough domestic demand,
Yeah.
to put its way through.
Yeah.
But the UK, again, it's over levered, it's private sector credit, it's a lot of credit driven consumption. If people start to pull back because their budgets are being constrained, that means you will take a hit, and that probably will show up in unemployment at some point. So again, it's like, different strokes for different economies in a sense. But yeah, Britain's in a tough spot. I mean, it was already in a tough spot just with the effects of Brexit, right? And this is sort of my short-term sort of retort to the short-term view on Scottish nationalism. You can't turn a border into a positive. It basically means you will
Yeah.
pay more costs than you have, right?
Yeah.
So when you leave a free trade zone, you're going to be paying more costs. It's as simple as that. And the estimate I saw across the board is about 10 to 12% of costs increase for many of these firms that used to export or still export into the EU, right? So which
That's
means
surely, I
you've
mean,
got to do
that's
what?
surely a margin for a lot of firms, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a lot. Exactly. So in other words, what do you have to do? You have to push down on wages or find other cost savings to still make that worthwhile, etc. Right? And think about that process kind of amplified by all these different factors, right? So you're going to have a lot of squeezing to make it work into that new space, none of which is going to be particularly pleasant. Unfortunately, it's not the people who will be gloriously unaffected are the sort of asset holding top 20%. So basically,
Again.
people that own 70% of all equities and have 2/3 of the housing wealth, even though they're like a tiny fraction of the population. And why is this? Because basically, when you raise interest rates, you're literally just dumping free money into their bank account. Right? So
Yeah.
on the one hand, you're taking away. On the other hand, you're absolutely giving. So yeah, as usual, the inequality underneath it all will amplify these effects.
So what is the way to structurally kind of change the shape of the British economy for the better that actually works for the majority of people, as opposed to a tiny minority sat at the top that have made the decisions for the last 600 years?
Well, first of all, you're going to have to change a tiny minority at the top, and it's pretty hard to do that. I
Unless
remember
you've
when
got
I started.
pitchforks.
Exactly. When I the pitchforks don't always work the way you think. When I started studying stuff years and years ago, 40 years ago now, I remember reading a book from the 70s, Stanhope and Giddens, two sociologists, and it was about the class structure of British society. And it just had these astonishing statistics. It was like 70% of 90% of Anglican bishops and 70% of Labour cabinet ministers, 90% of Tory cabinet ministers, army officers, you name it, right? All went to basically 9 schools and 2 universities, right? And things have broadened out a wee bit, but not nearly as much as you would expect.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, when Labour and Tories are shouting at each other from either side of the aisle, it's basically 2 factions from Oxford and Cambridge having a pillow fight. It always has been. And until, that is finally broken up and disestablished, I don't see how you move forward. Technocratic, clever people is not really a winning formula at the moment. It's not what's required. I'm very fond of basically decentralizing. As I mentioned earlier, I think that what if you had a kind of 15 to 20 year project of really rebuilding the infrastructure of the North and improving connectivity and everything, and redesigning sort of, getting rid of these little mayordoms and all the rest of it, making it of a more consolidated entity, doing the same thing with Scotland over time, leading possibly up to an actual independence or a greater independence. Then it's just more balanced. It's healthier, right? It's sort of like you don't have the phenomena where you like wake up, go to school, you go from school to college, and then you get a job in London, right? How about breaking that, right? How about getting a job up north or in Edinburgh, wherever it happens to be, and it's one where you want to stay, and it's where you want to buy your house, and it's where you want to build a family, right? It's none of this stuff's that difficult. It's just having that as the focus.
So in order to kind of do that infrastructure building, of course, again, people will go, oh, well, this is just going to be, more public sector debt, etc. Could you just explain to people that you can spend before taxing?
Well, yeah, you can. It also depends on what you're spending it on. I mean, if you're spending it on anything at all that builds an asset, whether it is a road, a bridge, a school, a telecoms network, or whatever, so long as that asset has a positive rate of return and the economy is growing, then your share of the debt is getting smaller, right? It's kind of, it's a simple thing. If you imagine imagine a sum, right? 100 over 100, right? And that's the economy, 100% debt to GDP. Debt's in the top, economy's in the bottom, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you spend 20%, you went to 120% debt to GDP. Oh, that's terrible. Yeah, but what if the economy as a result goes to 130?
Yeah.
Right. Now you're down to 90%, right?
Yeah.
So the sums don't work out that way. And so long as you're getting a positive rate of return, i.e. don't issue debt or basically finance just for consumption, which is what we epically do on the private sector side, less on the public sector side, then, you can totally do this. Now, is it as easy as it was before when you were facing kind of negative real rates all the way through with inflation? Well, no, it's not, to be perfectly honest. And if that demands higher interest rate payments on debt, then you have to think about it. But, there are other ways to finance. And if you don't, here's the thing, you always got to think about the opportunity cost. What happens if you don't do it?
If you don't do it,
Right? And to me, this is the climate change one, just to bring this one in, right? Oh, but it's not economic to do this. You know what's not economic? Being dead, right? So is it really a question of
being
economics,
on fire,
right? I mean, well, it's not economical to not be on fire. What could that possibly mean? All right, it's 10 minutes to here, and I got to get to the gym, so I'm going to have to love you and leave you at this point.
Okay, sure, not a problem. Cheers, Dr. Blyth. Take it easy. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Let's check in again. I know. Let's do this again in 6 months and see where we are.
Really? Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah,
great.
Let's do that.
Brilliant.
When I finally make it back to Nottingham, you can buy me a pint and a curry.
Definitely, 100%.